On the 8th of November 1942, over the Gilbert Islands, the sky twisted with thin white trails like strands of coiled rope. Pilot Lieutenant Robert Scott maneuvered his P-40 Warhawk, banking sharply left as gunfire from the Japanese Zero behind sliced through his tail. He gripped the control stick tightly, finger poised on the trigger, the 6 synchronized, 50 Browning machine guns in both wings fully loaded. When Scott pulled the trigger, only the dry click of metal echoed. Click, click, click. All 6 guns fell silent at once. According to the Henderson Field Technical Team's combat log, it was the first recorded incident where the entire firing system ceased operation in the opening burst. Scott dove abruptly into the clouds, evading the tracers closing in on his back, and landed trembling, his aircraft riddled with holes. His story was not an isolated case. From Guadalcanal to New Guinea, a series of pilots sent reports describing the same phenomenon, widespread jamming of the Browning. 50M2 during combat. According to the U.S. Army Air Force's Ordnance Survey, December 1942, the failure rate that year reached 18.22%, meaning nearly 1 in 5 guns malfunctioned on mission. For aircraft carrying 6 to 8 guns, the probability of at least one failing per sortie rose to 75%. A frontline engineer at Espiritu Santo scribbled in the margin of a statistical sheet, "The guns fail together, as if they made a pact." In the South Pacific Front, the issue struck directly at morale. In aerial combat, the line between life and death lay within the first 2 seconds of pulling the trigger. American aircraft relied on the volume of fire advantage. 6 guns firing simultaneously produced a dense stream of bullets capable of cutting an enemy fighter in half within a single burst. But when the guns fell silent, the pilot was forced to break off, descend, and accept falling within enemy sights. A telegram dated the 12th of November 1942, sent from Munda Base, stated bluntly, "Losses increasing, weapon reliability critical." Internal statistics from the 5th Air Force indicated that over 60% of missing aircraft cases that November were linked to weapon malfunctions. Telegrams from maintenance centers in Rabaul, Port Moresby, and Lae, preserved in the AAF Technical Command log, revealed a situation worse than official numbers suggested. Numerous technicians reported similar types of damage: torn cartridge heads, hairline cracks in bolt assemblies, or firing pins striking off-center. One maintenance group noted, "Every 10th barrel change ends with a dead gun." In other words, 1 in 10 guns became permanently silent after barrel replacement. In the humid climate, with persistent rain and fine sand seeping into every joint of steel, readjusting the headspace, the distance between the bolt face and cartridge case became torture. A pilot from the 475th Fighter Group recalled years later in an interview with the Smithsonian, "It wasn't fear of the enemy, it was the fear of silence. When you pulled the trigger and nothing happened, the air itself felt heavier." That statement captured precisely what hundreds of men felt as they flew home, powered only by engines and luck. In a documentary screened in Washington in 1946, the room fell silent as footage showed a P-38 landing with 6 blackened Browning barrels, faint smoke still rising from the seams. The projector hummed softly, and the narrator's voice droned evenly. They fought with weapons that could not be trusted. According to the USAAF Ordnance Maintenance Review, Pacific Theater 1942, analysis traced the cause to misalignment in headspace and timing, 2 parameters governing the firing cycle. The bolt had to close completely, and the firing pin had to strike the primer within thousandths of a second. If too early, the cartridge exploded before the chamber locked. If too late, back pressure fractured components and halted the next feed. Units were issued go and no-go gauges for manual adjustment, but the process required a flat surface, stable lighting, and proper tools. In the field, with aircraft still hot from sorties, technicians had to rely on touch. A deviation of less than 0.01 inch could render a gun useless. In his December 1942 report, Lieutenant Colonel W.H. Morgan of the Army Air Forces wrote, "Field armorers are performing miracles with tools designed for benches, not foxholes." The note was archived as a desperate warning in technical files. At rear factories, returned gun batches arrived covered in notes. Timing inconsistent. Case rupture on burst 2. Bolt jammed mid-cycle. These guns were early M1000, 921, and M2 variants, manufactured with tolerances too loose to maintain stability under mass assembly. According to Air Force Ordnance Command statistics, the average Browning in the South Pacific reached only 840 rounds before its first jam lower than training standards. Some units, in desperation, improvised fixes, regrinding bolts, replacing springs, even shortening firing pins with hacksaws. These methods sometimes saved the next mission, but more often destroyed the mechanism after a few hundred rounds. A note in the 11th Fighter Squadron diary read, "We spend more time fixing the guns than flying the planes." To field commanders, the problem was not only technical but moral. The weapon advertised as America's deadliest aerial weapon had become the object of doubt among its own users. At a technical meeting in early January 1943, a young officer spoke in a strained voice. "Sir, it's not the Japanese I fear, it's the trigger." The room fell silent. Everyone understood that in the skies, where a single pull of the trigger decided life or death, the silence of the gun was more terrifying than enemy fire. According to AAF Technical Memorandum No. 42 to 117, the conclusion was that the fault lay not in John Browning's design, but in manufacturing precision and maintenance procedure. The system required manual recalibration after every barrel change, but battlefield conditions, vibration, mud, heat, and pressure made proper adjustment nearly impossible. The mechanism was too delicate to withstand the reality of modern warfare. When Robert Scott stepped out of his bullet-riddled aircraft that day, he did not know that his incident would become a textbook example in U.S. Air Force technical archives. A photograph captured the moment he stood beside his scorched P-40, gloves still clenched, later reprinted in the following year's report with a terse caption, "Pilot survived. Guns failed." The report's final line contained only 4 words: headspace and timing errors. And in the silence of that meeting, no one imagined that just a year later, an engineer at Springfield Armory would change the weapon's fate forever. Beginning with the numbers, the engineering story that emerges is not a series of isolated faults but a pattern of systemic failure. The 1,925 survey of 500 M1921 rifles showed 47% had headspace deviations, 61% had timing errors. On average, each gun functioned for only 840 rounds before its first malfunction, and in 23% of cases, after a barrel change, the weapon could not be fired. These figures are set out plainly in the report and demonstrate that manual adjustment methods were wholly powerless under battlefield conditions. Reading those figures, one must immediately grasp the nature of the problem. Headspace is the gap, measured in thousandths of an inch, between the cartridge rim and the breech face. Timing is the instant the firing pin strikes the cartridge when the bolt is fully locked. 3 failure modes repeat across every report: premature cartridge detonation before the bolt is locked, late strikes causing unstable pressure, and cartridge case separation, leading to mechanism jams. Each mode arising from mechanical tolerances so small they are invisible to the naked eye. In workshop conditions, these errors can be corrected. In a frontline repair dugout, with poor light, tired hands and sand ingress, there is no way to guarantee workshop-level results. Into that picture steps a man who calmly said, "Precision eliminates adjustment," a phrase not a fashionable slogan, but the thesis of an engineer named Samuel Green. He was a manufacturing engineer at Springfield Armory who saw the difference between a beautiful drawing and a weapon that would survive in the sky. Green did not argue about the power of individual cartridges. He foregrounded the process. If each part were machined to sufficiently tight tolerances, there would be no reason to rely on the skill of a craftsman under adverse conditions. This notion shifted responsibility from the front lines to the factory, and it directly challenged prevailing production habits. His solution was not a novel shape, but a rethinking of the process. Rather than accept that headspace and timing must be adjusted after every barrel change, Green demanded that the factory fix those parameters at the source by machining each component to tolerances about 10 times tighter than the then standard, reaching plus or minus 0.001 inch. To achieve this, he redesigned the locking mechanism, altered machining methods and the inspection regime, and required every critical part to be measured, compared, and test-fitted individually before leaving the plant. The idea sounds simple, but realizing it required upgrading machinery, inspection procedures, and a will to invest. Some members of the board initially scoffed that producing to such tolerances was impractical. A few contractors said costs would double, and many experts argued it would be difficult to ensure mass-produced parts met the same standard. Green answered with a decisive plan. If a gun could not survive the harshest test, it did not deserve to go to the soldier. That was the origin of the test later called the suicidal proof. On the 15th of March 1932, in Springfield Armory's laboratory, Green loaded the gun with proof cartridges whose propellant had been increased by 30%, producing chamber pressures up to 70,000 pounds per square inches. Each round could blow apart the receiver if a small deviation existed. The danger zone extended to about 20 feet, which is why many called the test reckless. He fired 10 proof rounds in succession. The blasts, dust, and fragments followed each shot, and after each one he checked with gauges, removed the bolt, inspected the locking lugs, placed his finger on the metal edge, and felt for heat that small action conveyed a particular psychology. He was verifying that the machining calculations had held in practice. The testing did not stop there, because a prototype that survived 10 proof rounds did not prove durability under combat conditions. Green put 6 prototypes into a never-ending stress test cycle, loading them with a total of 50,000 rounds, changing barrels every 5,000 rounds, firing a proof round after every 500 rounds, soaking samples in salt water, coating them with mud, then firing, freezing and thawing to test reactions. Every scenario was simulated. The data were recorded meticulously, inspection results bagged by day, and when the tests concluded, the figure Green presented to the board was clear. The new M2 achieved a field reliability of 94%, compared with the 68% recorded for the M1921. Measurement tables, notes in black ink, and snippets of recorded commentary from the test assistant after each shift all combined to form irrefutable evidence. But numbers alone were not enough to persuade decision-makers, for cost and scalability remained questions. Green understood this. He provided the full production documentation, detailing each machining step, and a list of contractors capable of upgrading their equipment. He visited workshops, stood beside machinists, placed his hand on the lathes, sometimes examining a blank with closed eyes, as if testing a musical note. An assistant later recalled, when he ran his finger along the bolt, he smiled like a man who found the last piece of a puzzle. That small, specific image softened the dryness of the data. The outcome of the process was not merely a more durable gun, but a shift in weapons manufacturing thinking, from accepting in the field adjustment to emphasizing quality at the source. Green turned a repair problem into a production problem. He converted the pilot's fear of silence into the confidence that when the trigger was pulled, the mechanism would respond, the shot would follow, and that was the difference between life and death over the sky. On the 8th of April 1932, inside the meeting room of the Army Ordnance Board in Washington, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and cigarette smoke. 20 leather chairs were arranged in a circle around a dark wooden table, on which lay a stack of documents over 200 pages thick, the submission by Samuel Green, containing tolerance charts, stress test results, and photographs of two prototypes that had withstood 70,000 pounds per square inches pressure levels. Sunlight filtered through a narrow window, cutting through the haze like mist in a factory. In that room, a decision was about to be made that would shape the history of American weaponry. A total of 12 senior ordnance officers and engineers attended. They represented different divisions: procurement, logistics, cost control, and tactical design. From the start, the atmosphere was tense. Green's report proposed a new M2 built to tolerance standards 10 times stricter than current specifications, requiring precision lathes, double inspection time, and an estimated 200% higher production cost than the M1921. One officer shook his head as he turned the first page. "We can't afford perfection in wartime production." His voice was cold as steel, echoing the familiar fear of every administrator that technical idealism was the enemy of productivity. Green sat at the head of the table, both hands resting on the stack of documents, calm but sharp-eyed. He was no orator. His voice was steady and slightly hoarse, the kind of man more accustomed to speaking in workshops than boardrooms. When asked about production scalability, he answered briefly, "We cannot keep fixing a design that depends on human luck. No adjustment, no failure." Some smiled faintly, others took notes in haste. Colonel Frederick Rice, head of weapons procurement, shot back sharply. "That's easy to say for 6 hand-built guns, Doctor. But how do you build 50,000 of them?" Green replied, still even-toned. "By teaching factories to build right once, not to repair forever." The room went silent for several seconds. Green's presentation included data from a 3-week test at Springfield Armory. 50,000 rounds, barrel changed every 5,000, proof fired every 500, with 0 mechanical failures. He pointed to a chart where the figure 94% reliability was underlined in red. Across the table, the cost analysis engineers objected that achieving a tolerance of plus or minus 0.001 inch was impossible to mass produce, that existing machinery could not sustain such precision in serial manufacturing. A middle-aged officer with greying hair struck the table. "Even Browning himself didn't achieve that. Are you saying you can do better than the man who invented it?" Green looked at him and lowered his voice. "John Browning designed the idea. I made it real." The sentence cut through the air like a blade. The debate dragged on for hours. Some supported Green, arguing that his improvement could save thousands of lives by reducing jamming rates in air combat. Opponents continued to raise production barriers, warning that entire assembly lines would need to halt to recalibrate measuring tools. A chief engineer even cautioned, "At that precision, one wrong lathe cut means a whole receiver wasted." The arguments struck like hammer blows, each carrying its own weight. The official meeting record, preserved in the Ordnance Archive, contained a final line: "Meeting adjourned for lack of consensus. Awaiting Chief of Staff review." That signaled that a higher authority would have to intervene. Around 11 a.m., the door at the far end of the room opened. The echo of military boots filled the wooden floor. Douglas MacArthur, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, entered. His dress uniform fastened with silver buttons, insignia gleaming under the lights. His presence had not been announced on the meeting list. Everyone rose instinctively. MacArthur quietly took an empty seat at the center of the table, his eyes scanning the pile of documents. He spoke little, his hoarse voice measured and deliberate. "Gentlemen, I've read Dr. Green's report." No one answered. He turned to the page comparing the M1921 and the new M2, pausing at the line contrasting 840 rounds before failure with over 4,000 rounds average before malfunction. MacArthur closed the file and looked directly at the opposition group. "The current gun is killing Americans through unreliability. Dr. Green's design solves that problem." The decisive statement froze the room. He turned to Green. "Can you oversee production yourself?" Green nodded. MacArthur signed the final page of the proposal with a swift stroke, his voice deep and clear. "Then it's approved." That signature not only authorized a new weapon but redefined how the U.S. Army understood the meaning of strength. After the meeting, in a Pentagon hallway, Green stood silently for a few minutes. He held the copy of the decision, the paper still smelling of fresh ink beneath MacArthur's signature. A young officer passing by congratulated him. "Congratulations, sir. You just doubled the nation's manufacturing headache." Green replied with a faint smile. "A headache is better than dead pilots." That remark was later recorded in his memoirs, his entire professional philosophy distilled into a single sentence. In the following days, news of the M2's approval spread through the technical centers. Factories in New Haven, Chicago, and Detroit received orders to prepare for production line conversion. Industrial journals called it the most ambitious tolerance experiment ever attempted by the Army. Within engineering circles, the name Samuel Green began to be mentioned alongside Brownings, though with a different meaning. Browning was the creator. Green was the guarantor of survival. The 8th of April 1932 meeting would later be described by ordnance historians as the Day of Precision. It marked the first time in U.S. history that manufacturing tolerance was recognized as a strategic factor equal to firepower and speed. According to an internal Ordnance Department report, within 6 months of that decision, Springfield Armory began its first M2 production line under Green's direct supervision. Archival notes recorded that after MacArthur left the room, he paused at the door and quietly told an aide, "Tell Dr. Green this war will be won in factories before it's fought in the skies." When the story of that meeting was retold years later, people still recalled that moment as a turning point in their thoughts. In the smoke-filled room of April 1932, amid calculations and budget arguments, one engineer convinced the military that precision was not a minor detail of production, but the backbone of victory. And in that silence, history turned its gear forward. Before moving on to the next part, if this story resonates with you, please like and share so more people can see it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your words are the motivation that keeps us creating more great videos. In December 1933, the first M2S left the production line at Springfield Armory, carrying a large question: could an idea of ultra-tight tolerances be turned into a mass-produced product or not? Samuel Green stood at the edge of the shop, his hands stained with oil, his eyes fixed on each component as workers set them on the inspection table. He opened the inspection box, measured each lug, recorded the figures in black ink, then stepped back to observe the whole, the repeated action taking on the character of a ritual. The first guns, in the initial batch, were all accepted personally by Green. Each critical dimension was checked before the guns were boxed for shipment. The industrial impact did not arrive as a proclamation, but as the sound of machines running through the night. Manufacturing plants in New Haven, Chicago, and Detroit had to buy new lathes, install micrometers, train workers in quality control procedures, and standardize every recorded step. Maintaining tolerances at ultra-small levels was not a one-person task. It became a systems problem. Gauges had to be calibrated, the shop environment had to be controlled, and the inspection process had to be institutionalized. Technical journals described this phase as a retooling revolution in arms manufacturing because it forced the entire industry to change how it thought about productivity and quality at the same time. The change came at a cost, but the value proved itself sooner than many expected. The first batches of M2S were sent to frontline trials, partly sent to China during the 1937 Sino-Japanese War, where pilots and maintenance crews tested them under harsh conditions. Reported results from units that received the shipments indicated 63 aerial victories were recorded by aircraft fitted with M2. Only 2 failures were reported, and the causes in both cases were combat damage rather than intrinsic mechanical faults. Those figures appeared in reports sent back to Springfield as practical confirmation that the changes in the plants had translated into performance in the air. Bringing a prototype into mass production was not only a technical matter, but also a test of managerial capability. Green and his team had to draft step-by-step assembly procedures, from machining to final inspection, specifying who performed each operation and who certified it. Subcontracting factories, pressured to change, reacted initially with reluctance and then with technical seminars, engineers standing beside engineers, passing drawings, adjusting machines, trying cutting tools. A foreman later recalled, "We rewired our plant like a heart getting a new valve, painful then necessary." The remark is plain but accurate. It reflects upgrading the supply chain to meet the new standard. In the factory, people began keeping quality logs. Each part was coded, each dimension was marked, and every production lot was sampled at random. Only parts that exceeded the standard were allowed to proceed to assembly. The rest had to be reworked or scrapped. The elimination of out-of-spec parts initially angered workers, but plant leadership held firm to the argument that it was better to destroy a few parts at the start than to send them to soldiers who might return with broken weapons. Early industrial results, together with field data, created a feedback loop. As factories improved their processes, the product quality rose. Better products generated more positive field reports. Positive reports increased commanders' confidence to expand orders. The M2 not only proved it could survive Green's test, but it also forced the US industrial system to regard precision as a strategic resource. Changes in factories led to changes in procurement, which led to changes in maintenance training, and the entire supply chain adjusted to the new standard. At the strategic level, the M2's attainment of combat production standards meant the military no longer had to consider abandoning the half-inch caliber due to maintenance difficulties. Instead, it became clear that investment in production lines and quality control could pay dividends in aerial advantage. The complete replacement of the M1921 by the M2 in mid-1938 was practical proof of this, after which the gun became the standard weapon for the US, Army Air Corps, Navy, and coastal defense. This conversion signaled a different approach to modern war, in which industry is a direct extension of the battlefield. In the plants, Green monitored every production report. He received letters from subcontract managers with charts. He read failure descriptions like one reads a diary, and he replied with small directives, adjusting cutting tools, changing assembly sequences. A technician wrote in his memoir that the first time he saw Green smile was when a small batch passed inspection perfectly. He smiled like a man who had taught a reluctant student to understand music, the worker recalled. That small image, a smile amid a plant of smoke and oil, was a sign that the idea of tight tolerances could become reality. Records in the Springfield archives show that within a few years, the M2 production process was standardized, manufacturing manuals were sent to contractors, and quality standards became an inseparable part of contracts. Workers were paid premiums for precision work, machinery was maintained on schedule, and testing laboratories became permanent departments rather than ad hoc presences for troubleshooting. This process laid the foundation for a new capability. When war came on a large scale, America could transform its industrial capacity to produce highly reliable weapons, something previously thought unlikely. It can be said that success in the industrial proof phase did not merely rescue a gun from systemic failure. It demonstrated an important principle for the engineering age. If you want weapons reliable on the battlefield, start by manufacturing them correctly at the plant. At the end of this phase, the M2 had shown that Green's theory was not merely a slogan, but the new standard for modern arms production. When the M2S left the assembly lines and reached combat units, the question was no longer theoretical. It became a test written in steel and fire across the sky, every engagement a measure of reliability. Compiled field reports show that between 1942, 1945, over 2 billion M2 rounds were fired across global campaigns, with an average malfunction rate of only 1.8 per 10,000 rounds, a gun replacement rate due to wear of about 4.2% per year, and a recorded field reliability of 96.3%. These numbers were not propaganda. They came from workshop logs, mobile reports, and mission records printed in red ink, turning a factory concept into a living truth on the battlefield. To grasp the meaning of those numbers, one must look at the moments when pilots faced their enemies head-on. The case of Lieutenant Whitaker in Java, 1942, was a plain but decisive demonstration of performance. He fired a total of 2,400 rounds in a single engagement, scored 3 kills, and reported 0 malfunctions in his M2 system aboard the P-40. His tactical report was accompanied by a narrative describing how the synchronized streams of bullets shredded the enemy aircraft. Years later, amid the smoke over Normandy, Captain Robert Johnson returned to base after a prolonged battle. Reports vary between 2,400 and 4,800 rounds fired. His aircraft bore 225 bullet holes, yet the M2S kept firing, bringing his P-47 home and providing living proof that M2 durability translated directly into survival. Comparison with enemy weaponry paints a deeper tactical picture beyond raw figures. Efficiency analyses showed that to achieve one aerial victory, an American aircraft with M2S expended an average of 1,800 rounds, while 20mm MGO 151 over 20 cannons averaged 870 rounds per victory. However, the decisive difference was not in rounds per kill but in malfunction frequency in the ability to maintain steady fire in critical seconds. The M2's mission abort rate due to weapon failure stood at 0.7%, compared to 8.2% for the MGO 151 over 20. Internal pilot surveys revealed that 94% of M2-equipped pilots trusted their weapons, versus 73% among those using the MGO 151 over 20. Those figures led to a critical tactical consequence. In a dogfight, volume of fire mattered as much as power per round, because the decisive moment lasted only seconds, and a single jam could grant an opponent the window to survive. The M2 did not win because each bullet was stronger. It won because all guns fired together, consistently, allowing the pilot to sustain the attack until the target disintegrated. Reliability itself became the weapon. It turned ammunition into a continuous stream, not a chain of uncertain chances. These lessons appeared in Air Force tactical reports, where commanders noted that a jam is a death sentence, and that the most dangerous thing in the cockpit is silence when you pull the trigger. Examining overall data, the M2's stability changed the survival rate of bomber and fighter squadrons. The B-29 Superfortress, armed with up to 12 M2s in defensive mounts, carried them through bombing runs over Japan at extreme altitudes and freezing temperatures, yet the guns maintained steady fire. Reports from lead gunners indicated that most issues arose from condensation freezing, not from the weapon's mechanical faults. The nature of a system firing millions of rounds was fundamentally different from laboratory testing, and the M2 proved it could endure that scale. Deeper tactical analysis revealed the psychological effect of reliability. A pilot confident in his weapon dared to close in tighter, to hold the target longer in his sights, and to exploit opportunities others would abandon. Post-mission reports often noted that pilot confidence directly influenced decisions to pursue or disengage, and when weapons no longer depended on the luck of field mechanics, commanders could plan more aggressive operations. In many cases, a P-47 or P-51 could exploit its speed and range advantage, but if the guns were prone to failure, that advantage vanished. The M2 eliminated that uncertainty, turning speed and altitude into true tactical assets rather than compensations for unreliable firepower. Some critics argued that rounds per victory data might be skewed by situational differences, but even allowing for statistical variance, the trend was clear. The M2 significantly reduced malfunction risk, reflected in bomber return rates and fighter loss reports. British and Allied commanders noted that facing American aircraft meant confronting steady, unbroken streams of fire rarely interrupted by a lucky jam. This forced tactical adaptation and a newfound respect for what statistics represented. In the context of modern warfare, the M2 became a design lesson. A reliable weapon could win not merely through power, but by forming a dependable combat system enabling units to coordinate, trust, and act decisively. The figures 1.8 per 10,000, 4.2%, and 96.3% were more than data points. They embodied a new perception where industrial precision became tactical superiority, where manufacturing quality equaled strategic position, and where the silence of a trigger was no longer terror but rarity. And in that quiet, pilots could aim, fire, and come home. When the guns fell silent, the question that remained was what had survived alongside history. From 1933 to 1945, the Browning M2 evolved from a doubtful prototype into an enduring symbol of mechanized war. When the world's cannons stopped, Springfield Armory's production lines did not, because the Army realized that what had been created was not merely a weapon, but a standard of engineering. According to the U.S. Ordnance Final War Production Summary, 1,946, over 2 million M2S had been produced, with total combat ammunition fired exceeding 2.3 billion rounds, enough bullets, if laid end to end, to circle the Earth 3 times. Those guns had appeared on every battlefield, from Normandy to Okinawa, and after the war, they continued to serve in over 100 countries, mounted on armored vehicles, ships, aircraft, helicopters, and even field defense stations. That achievement was measured not only in numbers, but in lives. Post-war analysis by the US Air Defense Bureau estimated that the M2's reliability had saved approximately 25,000 people, including 2,800 aircraft spared through functioning defensive guns, 18,600 crew members, and about 4,200 pilots who survived encounters thanks to uninterrupted fire. Scattered through various reports, these figures became statistical proof that sometimes victory came from reducing the probability of failure, not increasing firepower. In a 1947 Army Air Force's post-war seminar, Colonel Robert Johnson, the man who survived with 225 bullet holes in his aircraft, told young cadets, "What saved me was not courage, it was a machine that refused to quit." That line was later quoted in the 1950 summary report as evidence of the value of manufacturing precision. For the industry, the M2 became a classic case study of manufacturing precision as a strategic resource. As the war expanded, the United States did not win through newer weapons, but through assembly lines capable of producing weapons that worked consistently. In an MIT manufacturing textbook from 1948, the phrase, "Tolerance can win wars," was used as the title of the opening chapter on strategic mechanical engineering, with Samuel Green's name cited as proof that machining discipline could shape the battlefield. His story spread beyond the military, becoming a reference point for aviation, medicine, and automation throughout the next century. Green did not merely change a weapon, he changed the mindset of engineering responsibility. In a handwritten note preserved in the Springfield archives, he wrote, "Machines are honest, they only fail when men build them carelessly." A short sentence, yet one that encapsulated his philosophy. Every small deviation in manufacturing equaled a fragment of mortal risk on the battlefield. Addressing a group of young engineers in 1944, he once said, "You can save a pilot by 1,000th of an inch." That statement was later engraved on a bronze plaque in the Springfield Armory Memorial Hall as a declaration of engineering ethics. Green's post-war life was quiet. He continued working at Springfield until 1953, retiring at the age of 62. At his farewell, there were no cameras, no reporters, only old machinists lining the hallway, presenting him with a small metal block engraved ±0.001 inch, "We remember." It was said he took the block home and placed it on his old desk, where he continued to read blueprints and revise notes until the end of his life. Green died in 1968, aged 77. His obituary in the Springfield Daily News read simply, "Retired engineer, Springfield Armory." No mention of the M2, no mention of war. But history does not forget for long. In 1973, a group of World War II veterans from the 8th Air Force Association traced records to find his widow, Evelyn Green. They presented her with a plaque inscribed, "To Dr. Samuel Green, whose precision saved our lives. Because of your work, our guns never failed us. Because of you, we came home." As she read the last line, Evelyn wept softly and said, "He would have smiled." That moment closed a journey honor, arriving 40 years late, but carried by the most truthful gratitude from those who survived. The influence of Green's philosophy reached far beyond his time. During the 1,950 seconds, 1,960 seconds, as American industry entered full mechanization, the ±0.001 inch tolerance Green had once deemed vital for the M2 became a foundational standard across countless civilian specifications. In aviation, it applies to wing structures and jet engines, in medicine, to surgical instruments, in technology, to computer component manufacturing. That a standard born from the survival demands of war became the benchmark of peace demonstrated the reach of the idea of precision as morality. The M2's story also reshaped how people viewed the relationship between factory and battlefield. In the 1952 Ordnance Conferences, the term field-proof by factory began to circulate the belief that every weapon must be proven in the workshop, not on the front line. This principle came directly from Greene, from the days he insisted on firing 70,000 pounds per square inches proof rounds in laboratory tests. Later generations of engineers, from missile programs to the space industry, cited him as the archetype of a man who turned dangerous testing into a standard of validation. At a strategic level, the M2 lesson stood as evidence of concentrated industrial power. As the US entered the Cold War, the M2 continued to serve in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Afghanistan, and countless other fronts. Though new guns emerged, the M2 endured, almost unchanged in mechanism, having reached an optimal balance between power and reliability. Analysts called it the immortal machine gun. Today, more than 90 years after Greene's proof test, the M2 remains in service across every branch of the US military, with modern M2A1 variants still using the same bolt system he designed. In reflection, what set Greene's legacy apart was not the longevity of a single weapon, but the shift in how the world understood the relationship between engineering and ethics. In war, the two are often seen as opposites, technology on one side, humanity on the other. Greene united them in a simple equation. Precision is the highest form of compassion, because to prevent error is to prevent death. In his words, doing it right to the thousandth was the most practical way to save lives. That legacy still resonates in engineering schools and defense industries. When M2s on Humvees in Iraq or on helicopters in Afghanistan fire their rounds, that sound carries the echo of the man who spent half his life calculating to the thousandth of an inch. In modern factories, every time an engineer tightens a screw and rechecks a tolerance, they continue a tradition born in a small Springfield room in 1932, where one man chose to trust precision over chance. When asked in an interview near the end of his life how he wished to be remembered, Greene replied, "If they remember me at all, I hope they remember that we did our job right." Simple, brief, yet enough to summarize a century of engineering and ethics. His silence became an extension of the M2 itself, steady, resolute, and enduring, like the echo of its gunfire across old battlefields, reminding the world that precision is not a technical detail, but a human legacy for life. Thank you for joining this journey through one of the lesser-known chapters of wartime industrial history, where an ordinary engineer changed how the world understood precision and survival. Every detail, every thousandth of an inch, every figure contributed to a legend. The M2 Browning, the machine that has endured for more than 9 decades. If this story made you reflect on the value of accuracy and perseverance, stay with us as we uncover more hidden truths in history. Don't forget to subscribe to follow future battles.